Marcus Webb was 41 years old. A structural load analyst is for a municipal infrastructure firm outside Columbus, Ohio. When he discovered that the woman he had spent 14 years building a life with had been systematically planning to dismantle it for the previous 22 months, he found out on a Tuesday. Not a meaningful Tuesday, not an anniversary, not a holiday, not any day that would later make a good story about the specific cruelty of timing. Just a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the sky cannot decide between grey and white and settles on both, the kind of day that asks nothing of you and receives nothing in return. He had come home 30 minutes early because a site review had been cancelled. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for 4 minutes before going inside. The way he always did, decompressing from the 40-minute commute, calibrating from work mode to home mode the way engineers learn to do when the stakes of their precision live on both ends of the day, and the commute is the only decompression chamber available. The house was quiet in the wrong way, not empty quiet, occupied quiet, the particular silence of a space where something is happening that was not meant to be witnessed. He set his bag down by the entryway, walked through the kitchen, and found his wife Renata's phone face up on the counter. The screen had not yet gone dark. She was in the shower. He had not meant to read anything. He had reached past it to get a glass from the cabinet above, and the name on the screen had moved through his eyes before he could stop it. Dominic Farrell, a name he recognized. A name attached to a message he read in less than 3 seconds and could not unread. The message was not ambiguous. It did not require interpretation. It was the kind of thing that arrives with its own authority, the kind that does not wait for context and does not need it. By the time the water stopped running down the hall, Marcus had replaced the phone exactly where he'd found it, face up, at the same angle, poured a glass of water he didn't drink and set it by the sink, and was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, breathing at the pace of a man who has just done the math and confirmed the load-bearing calculation that changes every blueprint going forward. He said nothing that evening. He said very little the following morning. He had already begun to work. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This story moves fast, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Marcus Webb had grown up in Dayton, the second of 3 sons in a household that ran on precision and quiet expectation. His father had been a civil engineer who assessed bridges for a living, a man who believed that the truest form of respect you could show a structure was to test it before you needed it, to account for the loads before they arrived, to build the redundancy in during the design phase rather than scrambling for it after the first crack appeared. His mother, Gloria, had taught high school chemistry for 31 years and retired with the calm of someone who had seen everything she expected to see and a few things she hadn't, and who had decided that the few unexpected things had, in the aggregate, not been sufficient cause for revision of her fundamental operating approach. Marcus had absorbed both of them, his father's methodical patience, his mother's willingness to be wrong until the evidence said otherwise, to hold the hypothesis loosely and let the data arrive without flinching from it. He had gone to Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, finished his degree in civil engineering in 4.5 years, and spent the next 7 building a reputation in municipal infrastructure assessment that was, by every measurable standard, the result of doing excellent work quietly and letting it accumulate. He was not the loudest voice in any room. He was, consistently, the most trusted one. His colleagues said this about him in the way they said things about the most reliable elements of their professional environment, not with particular flourish, but with the steady acknowledgement reserved for things that have never once failed. He had a way of finding the fault in a structure before the structure announced it, a quality that his supervisor had identified in his second year and had built project assignments around ever since. He did not mind being counted on. He had grown up in a house where being counted on was a baseline expectation, not a point of pride. He had met Renata Callas at a mutual friend's birthday party in 2009. She was 28, working in corporate communications for a pharmaceutical distribution company, and she possessed a social fluency that Marcus had always privately admired in other people, the ability to enter a room and reorganize it around herself without appearing to try. to make each person in the conversation feel like the most interesting person in it, to move through social environments with the ease of someone who had never needed to calculate any of it. She was funny in the specific way that required intelligence to pull off, the kind of humor that rewards attention, and she was beautiful in the specific way that made other people feel included rather than diminished by the proximity. He had been drawn to her immediately and had waited 3 days before calling because he was constitutionally incapable of performing urgency he didn't feel, and because the waiting had felt, to him, like the appropriate calibration period for something he intended to take seriously. They were engaged in 2011, married in 2012, in June, in a ceremony at a hotel in downtown Columbus that Renata had organized with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she organized professionally, and that had concluded with a reception that lasted until midnight and was remembered by everyone who attended as one of the better parties they had been to. Marcus had stood at the front of the room and watched her walk toward him and felt the specific grounded feeling of a man who has made the correct decision and knows it. Elijah was born in 2014 on a Wednesday in March at 4:22 in the morning, and Marcus had held him in the recovery room and felt something that he had no engineering language for, a weight and a lightness simultaneously, a structural reconfiguration he had not anticipated and had not needed to. Nadia came in 2016, in September, and was born with the composed expression of someone who has already had opinions about things and is simply waiting for the appropriate moment to make them known. Marcus had worked every possible overtime hour during Renata's first pregnancy because she had wanted to stay home with the baby, and he had agreed, without caveat, without condition, that this was the right thing to do. He had said it plainly, on a Sunday afternoon in March, sitting at the same kitchen table where he would later sit with his hands flat and his breathing measured. He had said, "I want you to be home with him. I'll make it work." And he had made it work, the way he made every structural problem work, by accounting for the load ahead of time, by building the supports before they were needed, by doing the math without complaint and executing the plan without requiring acknowledgement of the sacrifice embedded in it. He had put in for the overtime. He had taken on the weekend site visits. He had come home at 7 on the evenings when the project required it and not once presented this as a grievance. He'd understood it as his share of the load and had carried it accordingly. By 2018, he had been promoted to Senior Load Analysis Director at the firm, a title that came with a modest salary increase, a larger desk he rarely sat at, and the professional weight of being the person other engineers brought their hard problems to when they had run out of their own runway. He made $112,000, and he had paid off both cars in sequence. He was putting money into 2 college savings accounts and a personal investment fund. Every month without fail, the amounts adjusted upward as his income grew, the accounts quiet and compounding in the background of a life that felt, to everyone who saw it, like a life that had been built with care and would hold. He coached Elijah's soccer team on Saturday mornings in the fall, standing on the sideline in the specific Midwestern cold of an October soccer morning with the other parents, the kind of cold that arrives before you feel ready for it, but to which you resign yourself with a coffee and a hat. He drove Nadia to her violin lessons on Thursdays and sat in the waiting area of the music school reading site, assessment reports on his phone while she played, and then listened to her tell him everything about the lesson on the drive home, with the same attention he gave to anything she needed him to hear. He did not outsource any of it. He did not perform any of it. He did what he had decided to do, and did not particularly require acknowledgement of the doing, because he had come from a house where the doing was the acknowledgement, and the rest was noise. Renata had returned to work part-time when Nadia started kindergarten, picking up a contract communications role for a logistics startup called Farrell Group Solutions that had been referred to her through a former colleague who had done some marketing work for them. Marcus had been glad for her. He had said so directly and without qualifier. He had said, "You're too good at what you do to not be doing it." And she had smiled at him in a way he remembered precisely, a smile that contained something he couldn't name at the time. Something slightly too interior for the moment, the kind of smile that belongs to a conversation happening in one register while the face presents it in another. He had filed it. He had no category for it yet. He went back to the site assessment on his phone and did not think about it again until October. Dominic Farrell was the founder of Farrell Group Solutions. He was 38, once divorced, the kind of man whose LinkedIn profile read like a highlights reel assembled from partial seasons. Early promise, some growth, a gap, a pivot, a relaunch. He had the specific, practiced fluency of someone who had learned to lead with confidence and let the numbers catch up later. Marcus would come to understand him, months hence, the way he understood any structural system under load, by identifying the point where the material claimed more capacity than it actually had, and working backward from there to find when the overclaiming had begun. The Tuesday in October was not the beginning of Marcus's understanding. It was, he would later recognize, only the moment the load tolerance was finally exceeded. The moment a structure that had been accumulating stress announces itself. There had been other moments, smaller ones, filed without conclusion. A dinner conversation in May where Renata had referred to Dominic by his first name in a way that implied a familiarity she had not previously established, a casualness that did not match the professional distance she had maintained when describing the client relationship in earlier months. A weekend in August, when she had taken a work call in the backyard and stood facing the garden fence for 45 minutes, her shoulders at an angle he associated with conversations that required something of her. A Saturday in September when she had returned from a lunch meeting she had described in the morning in businesslike terms and arrived home carrying an atmosphere that did not match the description. Lighter, more interior, the specific quality of a person who has been, in some important way, elsewhere. Marcus had not ignored these things. He had catalogued them the way a structural analyst catalogues hairline readings on a test load, not alarming in isolation, data points awaiting pattern confirmation, requiring more load cycles before a finding could be issued. On a Tuesday in late October, the pattern confirmed itself. He called his best friend Raymond Ose at 6:47 the following morning, from the parking lot of a gas station, 4 blocks from his office, where he had stopped under the pretense of needing fuel, and the actual need for a phone call he could not make from the driveway. Raymond answered on the second ring, which was how Raymond answered everything, not because he was waiting, but because he moved toward things quickly once he had decided they were worth moving toward. Marcus told him what he had seen on the screen. He told him in exactly the order and language it had happened, without editorial comment, without the vocabulary of injury, the way you present data to someone who needs the data rather than the feeling around it. Raymond was quiet for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Who's your attorney contact?" Marcus said he didn't have one. Raymond said, "You do now. I'll send you her name and number in 10 minutes. Be in her office tomorrow morning if she can fit you." Marcus said, "I need to know what I'm working with first." Raymond said, "Then we start tonight." Marcus said, 7 o'clock. Raymond said, "I'll be there at 6:45. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Marcus sat in the parking lot for another 6 minutes after ending it, watching a woman in a red coat walk, a small dog past the entrance, the dog investigating the curb with the thoroughness of a small animal for whom the world is organized entirely at nose level. Then he drove to work and sat at his desk and opened the site assessment he had been working on the previous Friday, and worked on it until noon without interruption, because the work was real and the precision it required was real, and the precision was something he could trust absolutely, which was, on that particular morning, not a small thing. Raymond arrived at the parking lot behind Marcus's office at 6:43 that evening. He brought a laptop in a bag he used for his compliance consulting work, a legal pad with a pen clipped to the cover, and 2 coffees in paper cups from the diner 2 blocks away, dark roast, no modifications, the way Marcus drank it. They sat in Raymond's car, which smelled faintly of pine air freshener and carried the particular cold of an Ohio October evening, and Raymond set the coffees on the dashboard and opened the laptop and said, "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you know, not just this week, all of it," and Marcus began. He spoke for 22 minutes without interruption, and Raymond wrote on the legal pad in his precise, architect's block handwriting. Dates, names, amounts, sequences, the anomalies Marcus had noticed and filed, and not acted on. asking clarifying questions only at 3 points, each one a request for more precision rather than more emotion. When Marcus finished, Raymond looked at his notes for a moment and then looked at Marcus and said, "How long have you been sitting on pieces of this?" Marcus said, "Long enough to see the pattern." Raymond nodded and turned back to the laptop and said, "Then let's get to work." They stayed in the parking lot for 2 hours. When Marcus drove home that night, he drove home with a list. The attorney Raymond had sent him was named Cecile Armistead. Raymond had known her for 6 years through a client referral and had retained her once for a property dispute that had been complicated by overlapping ownership documentation, and that she had resolved in 9 weeks through documentation so thorough that no courtroom appearance had been required. The other side's attorney had looked at the file and advised settlement within 3 days of receiving it. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus that smelled like recirculated air and the specific institutional quiet of floors where serious things happen without theatrical accompaniment. The reception area had 2 chairs, a table with a single plant, and a young man at the desk who spoke in the measured register of someone trained to receive distress without absorbing it, which was a quality Marcus found immediately reassuring. He waited 4 minutes before being shown in. Cecile Armistead was 53, reading glasses on a chain she was not currently wearing, a desk that held exactly 3 things, a legal pad, a pen, and a file folder that was not his, the city through the window behind her, which she appeared to have long since filed, in the same category as the color of the walls. She shook his hand, gestured at the chair across from her, and said, "Tell me what you know and tell me what you want." He told her both, in that order, in the same direct and sequenced way he had told Raymond. Evidence first, then the conclusion the evidence supported, then what he was trying to protect. She wrote on the legal pad as he spoke and asked 4 questions, each one precise, each one requiring a number or a date or a name rather than a feeling. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "What you're describing is a standard marital asset division attempt built on the assumption that you will not have prepared. The goal is to intercept that assumption before it becomes actionable." Then she told him what she would need: the financial documents in order, the timeline in writing, the professional asset record, the children's accounts documented separately. She told him the timeline she was working with and what he should and should not do in the meantime, in writing, on the phone, with the accounts. Then she said, "Do you have any questions?" Marcus said he had one. She said, "Ask it." He said, "Is there a scenario in which she doesn't know I know until the moment I need her to know?" Cecile looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "That is precisely the scenario we are going to build." The investigation ran alongside his daily life, the way parallel load paths run through a structure, invisible at the surface, bearing enormous weight underneath, without announcing themselves or requiring acknowledgement from the surface above them. Raymond took point on the public records research, which his day job in building code compliance had equipped him to navigate with the particular efficiency of someone who knows which databases to look in, which filing systems to query, and which silences in a public record mean nothing, versus which silences indicate that the document has been filed somewhere less obvious. Within the first 2 weeks, he had assembled a preliminary picture of Dominic Farrell's business finances that did not match the professional presentation of Farrell Group Solutions in any of its public-facing materials. The company's revenue filings were modest relative to the operational scope it claimed. Equipment lease agreements Raymond located through commercial record searches suggested overhead that the reported revenue would not comfortably absorb. There were 2 pending civil suits, both commercial, both the kind of thing that disappears in a first-pass search, but surfaces on the second when you know which court dockets to check and how to read the case numbers. Raymond printed the relevant documents, annotated them in the margins in his block handwriting, and brought them to Marcus in a folder on the following Wednesday. They reviewed them in the parking lot diner over breakfast before Marcus's workday began. Raymond said, "This company is load-bearing more than it can carry." Marcus said, "I know what that looks like." Raymond said, "I know you do." Marcus began his own parallel work on the home finances, which he had always been the primary manager of. Not because Renata was incapable, but because she had preferred to leave the financial architecture to him, a preference Marcus now understood with the specific clarity that arrives when you see the load-bearing assumptions of a relationship from the outside rather than from within it. He printed 18 months of statements from every account with the quiet efficiency of a man doing a site audit. He organized them by account type and date. He made summary pages in the format he used for structural reporting, a single page per account, the key numbers on the left, the trend line described in 2 sentences on the right, anomalies flagged in the margin. He brought the first set to Cecile in an accordion file at their second meeting, and she had looked at the summary pages before looking at the statements themselves. And then she had looked at him and said, "You've done this before," he said. "I know how to read a load diagram," she said. "Explain that to me once." He explained it. She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "The summary pages are good. Keep making them." The following week he had 3 more sets. He drove to his mother's house on a Saturday morning in early November, telling Renata he needed to return a hand level Gloria had borrowed for a picture-hanging project the previous spring. His mother lived in a small house in Bexley that she had moved to 4 years after his father's death, and that she maintained with the precise orderliness of someone who understands that the environment around you is a structural expression of the mind within you. She had a garden that she managed with the same systematic patience she had applied to 31 years of chemistry classrooms, and a kitchen that smelled on Saturday mornings like the coffee she had been making in the same machine since 2011, and had never once considered replacing because it worked and replacement required a reason. She was at the door before he knocked, which told him she had been watching for his car, which told him she was expecting a conversation that went beyond the hand level. She made tea. She brought it to the living room on a tray with 2 mugs and a small plate of cookies neither of them would eat. She sat in the armchair she had occupied for 30 years, the one with the slight permanent impression of her preferred sitting position worn into the left cushion, and she looked at him for a moment before he said anything, and then she said, "You already know something." "It was not a question," he said. "Tell me what you know, Mum." Gloria held her mug in both hands and looked at the window for 10 seconds, the specific quality of look that belongs to a person organizing what they are about to say into the correct sequence. Then she said, "I saw her with him in September, at the farmer's market in Dublin. I went for tomatoes on a Sunday morning. They were walking together by the flower stalls. They didn't see me." She paused. "They were walking the way people walk when they know each other better than the description they give of how they know each other. I almost called you that afternoon. I sat in my car in the market parking lot for 20 minutes trying to decide." Marcus was quiet. His mother said, "I didn't, because I didn't know precisely what I was seeing. I told myself I might be constructing a problem from a single data point, but I knew." She set her mug down on the tray with the careful placement of someone putting something down that they know is fragile. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't call," he said. "You were protecting me," she said. "I was protecting myself from being the person who was wrong about something this serious," he said. "You weren't wrong." And Gloria Webb closed her eyes for 1 second, the length of a single confirmed breath, and then opened them and said, "What can I do?" He said, "Keep going to the market. Don't change anything," she said. "And you?" He said, "I'm building the case." She reached across the coffee table and put one hand briefly on his knee, and then took it back and picked up her tea, because she was Gloria Webb, and she did not perform comfort as a theatrical exercise, but delivered it in the specific, accurate amounts the situation required. She said, "Your father would have done the same thing." Marcus looked at the window. He said, "I know." He drove home in 46 minutes, back in time to pick up Nadia from a friend's house and stop for groceries on the way. The second revelation came from Renata's younger brother, Tomas, who called Marcus on a Wednesday evening in mid-November from a number Marcus didn't immediately recognize, but answered because the area code was local, and he had been waiting in a general way for information to arrive from directions he hadn't fully anticipated. Tomas was 34, worked in commercial evac installation, and had always maintained a careful middle-distance relationship with Marcus that was cordial and warm, without crossing into the interior territory that would have required a different kind of trust. He was the kind of brother-in-law who remembers your coffee order and shows up when you genuinely need an extra pair of hands without being the kind who assumes access to your private life. When Marcus answered, Mass identified himself and then said, with the cadence of someone who has been rehearsing the opening, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I've been trying to figure out whether to call for about 6 weeks, and I've decided I have to. Marcus said, Go ahead. Tomas was quiet for 2 seconds and then said, She had him at the house in August. On the Thursday, you took the kids to the pool over on Trebu. I drove over to return a spare key I'd borrowed from Renata back in the spring for when you two were in Michigan, and I forgot to give it back. I knocked, and she answered the door, and her whole face changed when she saw me. He was standing in the entryway behind her. She introduced him as a work colleague, and I smiled and said I was just dropping off the key and left. He paused. I went and sat in my car around the corner for 15 minutes. I've thought about that 15 minutes maybe twice a day since August. He paused again. I should have called you then. Marcus said, You're calling me now. Tomas said, I'm sorry, man. I genuinely am. Marcus said, I appreciate it. He meant both things exactly as stated, which was the only way he meant things. He thanked Tomas, ended the call, and sat in his car in the office parking lot in the dark for 7 minutes. It was 6:22 p.m. The lot was mostly empty. A streetlight made a circle on the asphalt 30 feet from where he'd parked, and the rest of the lot was cold shadow and the specific silence of an outdoor space where nobody is. He sat in it and let himself feel, fully and without management, what he felt. The accumulating weight of confirmed knowledge, the specific quality of grief that is not surprise but is still grief, the way that knowing a thing and having it confirmed are two different forms of the same loss. He let the 7 minutes be what they were. Then he started the car and drove home and made dinner and helped Elijah with a math coach worksheet and listened to Nadia describe a piece she was learning and said good night to both children and went to bed and lay in the dark for 40 minutes before sleeping, which was, under the circumstances, a reasonable response time. By the first week of December, the picture was complete. Not emotionally. Emotionally, the picture had been complete since October, had been assembling itself since the farmer's market in September, perhaps since a dinner conversation in May. But architecturally, as a documented record adequate to the structural demands of what was coming next, it was finished. Raymond had assembled a civil records file on Dominic Farrell that included both pending suits, the lapsed business license in Indiana from a prior venture that had concluded without a public exit announcement, and a series of commercial property liens filed against Farrell Group Solutions, totaling in the aggregate an amount that cast the entire operation in a different structural light than its public presentation had suggested. Marcus had documented the complete marital asset landscape with Cecile. Every account, the investment fund and its current value, the children's college savings accounts and their separate legal standing, the equity in the house assessed at current market value, the pension and its marital period portion. He had the summary pages for every account. Cecile had them organized by relevance and by anticipated contention. It was during the document review meeting in Cecile's 14th floor office on a Thursday afternoon in early December that Marcus explained what he had been thinking about since mid-November. He had asked about it obliquely in their second meeting, testing the legal perimeter of the idea. Now he laid it out directly. He explained the structure he had in mind, the purpose it would serve, the mechanism by which it would be executed, and the timeline within which it needed to happen to be beyond legal contestation. Cecile had listened without writing, and then had been quiet for a moment, and then said, That is a legal and legitimate asset restructuring strategy, and it exists within a window that closes in approximately 7 weeks from today. He said, How long does it take to execute properly? She said, If the documentation is organized, and I am looking at a man whose documentation is organized, 4 weeks. He said, Start the paperwork. She picked up her pen and said, Tell me what you want the foundation to do, he told her. She wrote for 4 minutes without stopping. Then she looked up and said, I'll have the first draft to you by Friday. The Webb Family Education and Opportunity Foundation was established under Ohio nonprofit law on December 14th, a Tuesday, which was not a meaningful Tuesday, except that it was the specific Tuesday on which the paperwork was filed, and the legal structure that Marcus had designed was put into place with the permanence of a thing done correctly. The foundation's stated purpose, as drafted by Cecile and refined by Marcus over 2 evenings at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, was the funding of educational enrichment and post-secondary scholarship opportunity for Elijah Marcus Webb and Nadia Gloria Webb, with secondary provisions for broader community scholarship awards to be managed by a board of trustees named in the founding documents. The beneficiaries were his children. The purpose was their futures. The structure was irrevocable, which was the word Cecile had used, and the word the law required, and the word Marcus had understood as a load-bearing specification, not a plan, not an intention, a done thing. Marcus was not named as a trustee. His mother, Gloria Webb, was the founding board chair. Raymond Osei was the second trustee. The third trustee was Diane Park, a structural engineer Marcus had known professionally for 11 years. A woman who had twice told him directly that he was the most careful analyst she had ever worked alongside, and who had agreed to serve as trustee within 40 minutes of being asked because she was Diane Park, and she made decisions by evaluating the structure of the request and determining whether the structure was sound, and this one was. The initial capitalization of the foundation came from Marcus's personal investment fund, a transfer of $214,000 executed in accordance with the irrevocable contribution agreement Cecile had drafted, which contained the specific legal language that made the transfer a permanent gift rather than a revocable deposit, and which was witnessed, notarized, and filed in the sequence and manner that the law requires when you want something to be beyond challenge. The IRS designation application was filed the same week. The designation was granted by the end of the month. On January 3rd, Marcus came home from work, hung his coat on the hook by the entryway door, and found a process server's card on the counter next to a note in Renata's handwriting that said she had taken the children to her mother's for the week and that she had filed for divorce. He read the card. He set it back on the counter. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon from the bottle on the counter. The bullet he kept for the occasional Friday evening, and did not drink it. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, which was covered in 3 inches of snow that had fallen the night before and was doing nothing in particular but existing in the flat January light with the composed indifference of snow. The motion Renata's attorney had filed sought equitable division of marital assets, including, among other line items, the personal investment fund. The personal investment fund no longer existed in the form the motion described. It had been reclassified 41 days earlier. It was currently the operating capital of a registered and tax-exempt charitable foundation whose beneficiaries were Elijah Marcus Webb and Nadia Gloria Webb, and whose irrevocable contribution structure had been established in compliance with Ohio law and confirmed by IRS designation. He picked up his phone and sent one text to Cecile that read, "She filed." Her response arrived in 3 minutes. "I know. Expect my call at 8 tomorrow." He poured the bourbon back into the bottle, washed the glass with the soap and water, dried it, returned it to the cabinet, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He slept well. This was not indifference. It was the specific quality of rest that arrives when a man has done everything in the correct order, and the correct order is now bearing the weight it was built to bear, and there is no remaining decision to make tonight that could not wait until tomorrow's 8 o'clock call. He slept the way engineers sleep, when the load calculations are finished and verified, and the structure is standing, and the inspection will happen in the morning. January moved with the particular deliberateness of legal proceedings in the middle of a Midwestern winter, appointments made in conference rooms with institutional lighting, documents reviewed and across tables by people who have been paid to be precise and who are being precise, the procedural machinery of dissolution operating at its own pace and answering to its own calendar, rather than to the emotional urgency of the people it was processing. Renata's attorney was a man named Kellerman, who worked from an office in Westerville, and who had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to clients who arrived with emotional grievances against opponents who were not financially prepared. He filed the initial asset disclosure motion and received in response a documentation package assembled by Cecile Armistead, a 3-ring binder tabbed and indexed with the precision of a woman who understands that a well-organized document is itself an argument, containing the Foundation Charter, the IRS designation letter, the irrevocable contribution agreement, the trustee appointment records, the gift transfer documentation, with its date stamp and notarization, and a 12-page asset summary prepared in the load diagram language that Marcus brought to every document he had ever touched. Kellerman's response to receiving this binder was a silence of 4 business days, which Cecile translated for Marcus over the phone as, "He is recalibrating his position." She said it without pleasure. She said it the way you say that a measurement is accurate, as a factual observation with structural implications for everything that comes next. The preliminary hearing was set for the last week of January. Marcus and Cecile sat on one side of a long conference table in a courthouse meeting room that smelled like paper and the particular institutional neutrality of rooms designed to contain conflict without amplifying it. Renata and Kellerman sat on the other side. Renata was wearing a grey blazer and her hair was pulled back in the specific way she arranged it when she needed to be seen as credible. The professional presentation, the version of herself she assembled for rooms that required performance. She did not look directly at Marcus until the process required it. When she did, she held the look for 2 seconds with an expression that contained something he recognized as the specific quality of a person who has arrived at a confrontation and found the terrain does not match the map they were given. Then she looked at Kellerman, and Kellerman was speaking. Kellerman's initial position was that the foundation transfer constituted fraudulent conveyance, an asset movement executed in anticipation of divorce proceedings with the intent to deprive the marital estate of what was rightfully subject to equitable division. He laid this out with the practiced confidence of someone who has made this argument successfully before and is accustomed to it, landing as intended. Cecile let him finish. Then she opened the binder to the first tabbed section and placed a copy of the gift transfer documentation in front of Kellerman, without comment, and waited while he looked at it. She said, "The transfer predates any notice of dissolution by 41 days and is supported by documentation consistent with a legitimate charitable purpose, an established and independent board of trustees with no financial interest in the present proceedings, and a foundation charter whose stated beneficiaries are the couple's 2 minor children." She placed the IRS designation letter in front of him. She placed the foundation charter. Then she sat back and folded her hands on the table and said, "The irrevocability of the contribution is established in Section 4 of the agreement, which I have also included behind the green tab." Kellerman read for a moment. He said, "The timing is," Cecile said, "the timing is 41 days prior to service of process." She said it at the volume of a weather forecast. The hearing proceeded. The mediation ran through February. Marcus attended every session with the binder and Cecile at his left, and he sat in the measured way. He sat in all professional meetings, upright, attentive, unhurried, saying what was required of him when it was required, and otherwise occupying the room with the particular quality of stillness that his colleagues at the firm had long understood as the sign that Marcus Webb was paying close attention and has not yet said the thing he is going to say. Renata's position evolved in the sessions, the way positions evolve when the structural assumption they were built on has been removed. The load redistributes. The supporting elements are called on to bear more than they were designed for. Adjustments are made with diminishing momentum. The fraudulent conveyance argument was abandoned by the second session, having no adequate legal traction in the specific factual record Cecile had constructed. The conversation migrated to the marital equity in the house, the pension, the personal savings outside the foundation. These were real assets. Marcus had not touched them. He had not needed to. The foundation held what he had built, specifically and deliberately for his children. The rest of the marital estate would be divided as Ohio law directed. He had understood from the beginning and had built accordingly. It was during the third mediation session that Renata made the only statement she made in the entire proceeding that Marcus believed was entirely true, unmanaged, unfiltered by the professional register she had maintained for 3 months of legal process. The mediator had stepped out to take a call. Kellerman was reviewing a document, and had turned slightly in his chair. Renata looked across the table at Marcus and said, quietly, at near conversational volume, without the calibrated containment she had carried into every session, I didn't think you'd have done any of this. Marcus looked at her. He said at the same volume, without emphasis, I know. Then, the mediator returned, and the session resumed, and neither of them said anything further that was not required by the proceeding. He told Raymond about this exchange on a Saturday morning in March, at the diner on 5th Street, in the corner booth they had used for 30-minute breakfast meetings since the year after college, when Raymond had moved to Columbus, and they had established the ritual without naming it as one. Raymond listened to the whole thing, and then drank his coffee and looked out the window at the street, which was doing the specific thing that Columbus streets do on a late March Saturday morning, resuming, unhurried, in the tentative warmth of a season that has not fully committed. Then he said, what did it feel like to say that? Marcus thought about it for a moment. He said, like closing a door that I hadn't known was still open. Raymond nodded slowly. He said, is it closed? Marcus said, it's closed. Raymond said, good. And then he ordered another coffee, and they talked about Elijah's soccer season, which was starting the following Saturday, and a new municipal contract Raymond's firm was evaluating, and in the way conversation moves between men who have been through something significant together and come out the other side of it, forward, practical, specific, with the warmth of people who have trusted each other with the hard material and know they were right to. The final divorce decree was issued in April. The house equity was assessed and divided as the calculation directed. The pension was evaluated and the marital period portion allocated accordingly. Marcus's personal savings, the amounts that existed outside the foundation structure, were disclosed fully and divided equitably without dispute, because there was nothing there that had been moved or hidden or restructured. It was simply what remained, and it divided cleanly, and the proceedings were unremarkable in their mechanics. The only number that remained structurally beyond reach was the one that had been placed beyond reach 41 days before the filing date. The $214,000 now compounding in an education foundation in the names of his children, administered by a board of 3 trustees, none of whom had a financial interest in the divorce, and all of whom had agreed in writing to serve for the explicit and charitable purpose stated in the founding documents. It did not appear in the marital estate calculation. The law said it could not. The foundation had been built to say exactly that. Dominic Farrell's trajectory concluded in a different register, not with confrontation or announcement, but with the slow, atmospheric inevitability of structural failure that has been accumulating without audience and arrives without ceremony. The 2 civil suits Raymond had located in December proceeded through the spring. In May, one of them resulted in a judgment against Farrell Group Solutions, $78,000 for breach of a commercial supply agreement, a number that was not catastrophic in isolation, but which joined the other operational pressures to form the kind of aggregate load that a modestly capitalized operation with ongoing overhead cannot comfortably absorb. The company's operational status became uncertain in the way of things that don't issue press releases about their uncertainty, visible only in the public record to anyone who knew how to read it. Renata's contract work with Farrell Group Solutions had ended in February, by which means and under what terms Marcus did not pursue, because the information was not relevant to anything he needed to know, and because he had understood since October that the specific architecture of that situation would arrive at its own conclusions without his involvement. He found the apartment in Grandview Heights in March, before the decree was final, through a listing that Diane Park had mentioned in passing during a project debrief, the kind of mention that contains a careful reading of the recipient and a decision to offer rather than to suggest. It was the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on a tree-lined street 3 blocks from a coffee shop he already knew, with 3 bedrooms, east-facing windows that filled the kitchen with morning light until noon, and hardwood floors that made the particular sound of old floors that have been walked on for decades and have absorbed the weight with the equanimity of good material. It smelled like clean paint and the specific warmth of a building that retains heat well. He signed the lease on a Saturday. He drove home made dinner for himself and the children, and sat at the kitchen table after they were in bed and wrote a list of what the new apartment would need and in what order it should arrive. The list was precise and organized by dependency. The things that needed to happen before other things could happen, the load-bearing elements first. He executed the list over 3 weekends. By the week the decree was issued, the apartment was ready. Elijah and Nadia came for the first weekend in late April. Elijah inspected the apartment with the solemn thoroughness of a 9-year-old who has been told this is an important occasion and has decided to take the responsibility seriously. He went through each room with his hands in his pockets, which was a posture Marcus recognized from his own father and had apparently transmitted without noticing. He found the room Marcus had set up for him, the twin bed positioned under the window, the desk with the lamp he had requested, his cleats by the door, his soccer ball in the corner, and sat on the bed and looked around and said, "This is good, Dad," Marcus said. "I thought you'd like the window." Elijah looked at the window and said, "It faces the neighbor's yard. You can watch from here," Marcus said. "That's what I thought." Nadia spent 40 minutes arranging and rearranging her bookshelf before declaring the final arrangement acceptable, and then asked whether they could have breakfast food for dinner, which they did, because Marcus had the eggs and the maple syrup and no particular requirement that dinner resemble dinner. He made pancakes and scrambled eggs, and they ate at the small kitchen table with the light coming in from the east windows at the angle that belonged specifically to a late April evening, and Nadia talked about the piece she was learning on her violin, a composer she had found on her own, whose name she pronounced with the careful accuracy of a child who has practiced it. And Marcus listened without distraction and asked her 3 questions, each one because he wanted to know the answer. After the children were in bed, he sat in the kitchen, in the quiet. The apartment had the sounds of its own, a settling from somewhere in the building's bones, a hum from the heating system 2 floors below, the occasional specific percussion of a neighbor whose name he didn't yet know moving through their evening. He poured 1 finger of bourbon and drank it slowly, at the pace of a man who is drinking, because the hour and the occasion are appropriate to it, and not because the drinking is the point. He thought about his father standing on bridges, in the specific way his father had stood on bridges, not as an observer, but as someone conducting a conversation with the structure, asking it what it was carrying and whether it was carrying it correctly. He thought about his mother in her armchair, with both hands around the tea mug, and the way she had said, "Your father would have done the same thing," with the specific composure of a woman who knows that a well-placed statement of fact is also a form of inheritance. He thought about Elijah sitting on the new bed and saying, "This is good, Dad," with the authority of a child who has inspected the situation and reached a considered conclusion. He finished the bourbon, he washed the glass, dried it, put it away. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the apartment in the dark, listening to the city outside the east-facing windows, doing what the city did at midnight, continuing, without particular attention to the specific weight of any individual life inside it, which was not indifference, but was simply the scale at which cities operate. It had always been operating at that scale. He had simply needed, for a while, to be very focused on a smaller one. He was not a man who had been saved. He was a man who had built something that held. These were not the same thing, and the distinction mattered to him with the same precision that all distinctions between structural integrity and structural luck mattered. Completely, quietly, as the difference between a bridge that stands and a bridge that stands because it was designed to stand. He went to bed at 12:18. He was at his desk by 5:50 the following morning. The light through the east windows was the specific grey-white of a city morning. In late April, clean and without pretense, the kind of light that does not promise anything but does not withhold anything either. The light of a morning that is simply and entirely itself. In June, he was offered the senior project leadership role on the Mid-State Bridge Rehabilitation Initiative, a 6-county, 4-year structural assessment and rehabilitation project that was the largest single contract his firm had undertaken and the kind of structural challenge that required the specific quality of sustained, load-bearing attention that Marcus had been developing professionally for 17 years, and personally, it turned out, for considerably longer. The director who offered it said, "In the understated register of engineers who do not give compliments they don't mean. You're the right person for this. We've known it for a while." Marcus said thank you and asked for the project specifications. He took them home and read them at the kitchen table that evening for 2 hours. The structural challenges were real and interesting in the specific way that problems are interesting when they are at the precise edge of your competence, requiring everything you have and making you better in the process of deploying it. He accepted the role on the following Monday morning. He coached Elijah's soccer team through the spring season, as he had the previous three, standing on the sideline with the coffee and the hat and the roster on his phone, calling substitutions with the same precise attention he brought to load rotation calculations, which was perhaps not the intended framework for youth soccer, but which produced results. He drove Nadia to violin on Thursdays and listened to her describe the lesson on the drive home with the same attentiveness he brought to anything she needed him to hear. He had Sunday dinners with his mother every other week at the table in Bexley, where the tea was already on the counter when he arrived, and the conversation went where it needed to go without requiring setup or performance. Raymond came for dinner on the second Friday of each month, bringing a six-pack and the specific companionship of a man who had been present at the hard moment and had known what to do with it and had never made it about himself. The ordinary life that Marcus had always been building, the one that had continued running underneath the fracture, load-bearing and quiet, doing its structural work while the surface above it was complicated, had simply become visible. It had been there the whole time. He had known it was there. He had not needed to discover it so much as return to it, the way you return to a structure after an inspection and find it standing exactly as it was before you walked away. The foundation had its first full board meeting in May, in Gloria Webb's living room in Bexley, at the dining room table she had extended for the occasion, with the leaf she kept in the hall closet. Gloria presided with the measured efficiency of someone who has run 31 years of classroom operations and finds non-profit governance refreshingly cooperative by comparison. They approved the first year's operational plan, established the scholarship application process for the Children's Designated Educational Fund, reviewed the community award provisions that would be opened in the second year, and agreed on a December meeting for the annual review. Raymond had brought a box of donuts, which were not on the agenda, but which Gloria permitted without comment, the kind of permission that contains a smile she is not going to perform. Diane Park sent the meeting minutes to the group within 48 hours in a document organized under 3 tabs. Because that was how Diane Park operated, and because the Foundation deserved documents that met the same standard its founding documentation had set. Marcus read the minutes on a Tuesday evening at his desk in the apartment, the east window light going orange and flat as the day ended, and found them accurate, complete, and structurally sound, which was the only standard he had ever applied to anything. He took Elijah and Nadia to the farmers' market in Dublin on a Saturday in late June, the first genuinely warm morning of the summer, the kind of morning where the air smells like cut grass and the light comes down through the trees at the angle that belongs specifically to early summer in Ohio, clean and yellow at the edges of the sky, making everything it touches look more deliberately placed than it actually is. They moved through the stalls at Nadia's pace, which was methodical and thorough, because she was 6 and had recently developed opinions about tomatoes that she was committed to executing. Elijah ran ahead to the vegetable stand he liked and doubled back to report, operating in the specific orbit of a child who needs to know where the fixed point is before he can reliably depart from it. Marcus bought a paper bag of apples, a jar of local honey, and a small bunch of flowers that Nadia selected from the flower stall after a consideration that lasted 4 minutes and involved the rejection of 3 candidates for reasons she explained in complete sentences. She carried the flowers herself, with both hands, and the concentration of a person transporting something irreplaceable. They ate breakfast from a food truck near the south entrance, eggs and home fries in paper containers, the particular combination of smells that belongs to outdoor food on a warm morning, coffee steam and grease, and cut grass from the lawn beyond the fence. They sat at a picnic table near the parking lot, Elijah spilled his orange juice reaching for the hot sauce and looked at his father with the specific, held quality of a child awaiting assessment. Marcus said, "It's just juice." Elijah's face rearranged itself from braced to relaxed in the way faces do when the anticipated consequence does not arrive, and he mopped up the juice with 2 napkins and went back to his eggs. Nadia ate with focused attention and did not comment on the spill because she had already moved past it. They walked back through the market on the way to the car, and Nadia asked if they could come back next week, and Marcus said they could come back as many weeks as she wanted. She said every week. He said every week. She considered this proposal for a moment, found it structurally sound, and took his hand without being asked, the small warm weight of it in his palm. The two of them walking through the stalls in the early summer light of a Saturday morning that asked nothing of him except to be present in it, which he was. He did not think about Renata often. When he did, he thought about her with the accuracy that had replaced the feeling. Not bitterness, not longing, not the performed resolution of a man who needs to be seen letting something go. Just the clear, factual account of a structure that had been built on an assumption he had not checked and that had failed at the load he had placed on it. He bore his portion of that, as engineers are trained to do, because you do not walk away from a structural failure without asking what you missed in the assessment, what load you specified that the material couldn't carry, what redundancy you believed was present because you assumed it without verifying it. He had not missed the signals. He had trusted without verifying the foundation the trust was placed on. He had filed the anomalies and not acted on them. These were his decisions, and he acknowledged them without performance and without the self-flagellation that serves no structural purpose. He had also built what needed to be built when the moment required it, and he had built it correctly, and the foundation was standing, and his children's futures were intact and compounding. And the project that required 4 years and 6 counties, and the specific quality of sustained attention he had in abundance, was waiting for him every Monday morning in the form of a problem worth solving. This was not a victory, it was a calibration. He understood the difference, and the difference was the only thing that had ever mattered to him. And he had known it since he was a boy who watched his father stand on bridges and ask them what they were bearing and whether they were bearing it correctly. He was bearing it correctly. He had been bearing it correctly for longer than he had known he was being tested. That was the only sentence that needed to be written at the end of this story, and he had written it not in words but in documents, in transfers, in trustee appointments, in the specific and unambiguous fact of a foundation bearing his children's names that was standing irrevocably in exactly the place he had built it. The summer continued in its ordinary way, particular and quiet, and entirely his own. The project specifications spread across his desk in the Grandview apartment, the east morning light coming in clean and specific, the sound of the old building settling into itself, the way things settle when they have been built to last, and the building has decided it intends to. On a Thursday evening in late July, he came home from work and set his bag down by the door and stood at the east window, looking out at the neighbor's backyard below. The guard, there. The specific deep green of an Ohio summer at full volume. A dog lying in the shade of a fence. The sky at 6:30 in July, which is blue in the way of something that has made a decision about itself and is not revisiting it. The apartment was quiet. The children were with their mother this week. His phone showed a text from Raymond, asking about Friday dinner, and one from Gloria, asking if he could bring the children's soccer socks she'd mended when he came Sunday. He answered both. He started the coffee maker and went to his desk and opened the project specifications to the section he'd been working through the previous evening and picked up exactly where he'd left off, which is what you do when the work is real and the foundation is solid and the long view is the only view that has ever made structural sense, and you are the kind of man who knows how to take it.